All right, guys, here we go. This is our last section of notes in Unit 8, and it's entitled The Legacy of the War. So in our last section, we talked about how the war actually ended. We just want to kind of recap a little bit of some of the impacts of the war and a little bit of some of the costs of the war. All right, so the total number of dead in the Civil War, they estimate to be about 620,000. There are some historians that within the last about 10 years or so, think that number might be more in the 700,000 range, but this is kind of officially what most textbooks talk about. About 360,000 Union troops and about 260,000 Confederate troops. In addition, there were over 500,000 men that were also wounded in the war. So it's a very costly war. A lot of times you'll hear people talk about the Civil War as the deadliest war we've ever fought. To kind of put that into perspective just a little bit, this calculates the war deaths per 100,000 population at the time. So it's even more impactful when you think about the size of the United States at the time of the Civil War as compared to some other times we fought wars. So if you compare it to the 100,000 population, this is the Civil War. Not even remotely close would be second place with World War II. With 307 out of every 100,000. So this statistic really gives you a sense for how many people really were impacted by this war in terms of death, and then also in numbers of people that were wounded as well. All right, so there's two pictures of Lincoln. Lincoln had an incredible task at hand during the Civil War. Not only was he trying to win a war, he was trying to win a war with his own countrymen, and then at the end to try and bring them back. Okay, so I like to show this picture. When you first look at this picture, you might think that this is a very young Lincoln and then an older Lincoln. It's actually only 4 years different. So the one on the left is from 1861. And then the picture on the right is one of the last pictures of Lincoln in 1865. So you can really see how much it wore on Lincoln, and just physically like the toll that it took on Lincoln as the war went on. So during this time period, almost everybody either had a brother or a friend or an uncle or somebody that was very close to them that actually fought in the war. Almost 10% of the population served in the war. 1 out of every 10 people in the United States. Now, when you consider that, women weren't actually able to be in the army, that's half of the population, right? So we're talking about 3 million men in a country of about 30 million at this point. If we had a war today and the same percentage of people fought in the war, we would have an army of like 30 million men. Okay, so everybody was impacted by this war in one way or another. The war had high economic costs for both sides. Again, the dynamics of the Civil War is we fought a ton of this war in the southern states. Once the war is over, we bring them back to the United States. We have to then repair all of that stuff that was destroyed. A lot of times when you're fighting a foreign war, you're fighting in somebody else's country. You might help that country recuperate and, build things back and stuff. But in a civil war, you're literally having to build up your entire country back. So combined, the North and the South had spent about 5 times what government had spent in the previous 80 years. Okay. So fighting the Civil War is a very, very costly thing. And then trying to build all this stuff back once the war is over is also going to be extremely costly. So the war cost in 1865 was about $6 billion. Okay, it's kind of hard to wrap our head around that. That's in 1865. If you were to then make that more like a modern day figure and you translate it into like 2005 numbers, that would be like $7 trillion. Now that number still, thinking about like what 7 trillion is probably pretty hard for us to imagine. If you divided that amongst every American citizen, we would each have to pay about $24,000 to be able to get to $7 trillion. Okay. Now, there are some very concrete things that happen as a result of the Civil War. Millions of slaves are freed as a result of the war. After the war in 1865, the 13th Amendment is passed. We talked about that in one of our earlier units. That officially makes slavery illegal in the United States. So that's going to be a huge factor for millions and millions of people. And then one of the saddest things that happens just days after the official surrender, Lincoln goes to a play in Washington, D.C. on Good Friday of that particular year. And on April 15th, he's assassinated while he's watching a play at Ford's Theater. So the person that assassinates Lincoln is actually a fairly well-known actor at the time. His name is John Wilkes Booth. He was a famous actor. People knew what he looked like. He was a Southern supporter. He had a very elaborate plan with a whole bunch of friends that were helping him out. They were going to assassinate Lincoln that night. They were going to assassinate the Secretary of State. They were going to assassinate the Vice President. There was a major plot where all these people were going to kill some of the major political figures in the United States government. The other people are not killed. There's some very interesting history if you want to look at what happened with Secretary of State Seward and things like that. The only person that does get assassinated that night, though, is Lincoln. And then when John Wilkes Booth commits this crime in Ford's Theater, he actually escapes through Washington, D.C., goes down south, and he's captured days later. If you want to read a really good book, I believe it's called Manhunt. It talks about the process of trying to find John Wilkes Booth after this. This is an interesting photo that I always like to show. This is at Lincoln's second inaugural address. So he's giving a speech here in front of the Capitol, and John Wilkes Booth is actually right up here. So this was, months before this, but I always think this is just kind of an amazing picture to think of John Wilkes Booth being in the crowd so close to Lincoln, and then months later, he's going to actually assassinate Abraham Lincoln. So we won't get into a ton of detail. This usually, if I have this in class, we do like a couple of days talking about this, but John Wilkes Booth comes in through a back door that he preps that day in the theater, comes in, shoots Lincoln basically point blank. He then jumps off of this balcony in Ford's Theater, breaks his leg, gets on the horse, and then escapes. If you're ever in Washington, D.C., they've got an amazing museum about the Lincoln assassination in the basement of Ford's Theater. This is the gun that John Wilkes Booth used to assassinate Abraham Lincoln. It is in that museum. And this is what Ford's Theater looks like today. So Ford's Theater is interesting. This is what it looked like that night when Lincoln was assassinated. The building itself actually collapsed at one point later on, and they rebuilt it. But it's still a very historic building. But this is where Lincoln and his wife and then two guests were. This is the door through which John Wilkes Booth comes in, breaks in. He shoots Lincoln, and then he jumps off of the stage, off of here onto the stage, breaks his foot, and then goes out here. There's a horse waiting for him, and then he's able to escape Washington, D.C. If you ever are in Washington, you can tour Ford's Theater. They also have, it's actually an acting theater, so you can go and watch a play. I once watched a play there with some students back in the mid-90s when I used to take a class of high school juniors to Washington, D.C. every year when I taught high school students, and we were able to watch a play one day. And it was kind of weird when we were there. We were on the tour the day that we watched the play in the evening, and they had shut down the tour for a little bit, when we found out later that Princess Diana was actually there the same day. And when she came in to do the tour, they stopped the other tours, which we were on, so that she would have a private tour of Ford's Theater. So here, it's President's Box. And they keep it looking exactly the same as it was that particular night. And then this is where the people sit to watch the plays. And this is the view that John Wilkes Booth would have had as he went into the President's Box. And President Lincoln was sitting over here. And so this is the exact view that he would have seen right before shooting Lincoln. So this is the route that John Wilkes Booth takes afterwards. He hides out. A couple people basically give him shelter and allow him to stay in their homes and stuff. He's not actually captured until April 26th. So the assassination happens on the 14th. He is on the run for 12 days. They find him at a farm down in Maryland, and what they end up doing is, I'm sorry, this is actually Virginia. They find him on a farm in Virginia, and he's in this big tobacco barn, and they set the barn on fire to try and get him to have to escape. And he finally does come out. They're given orders not to shoot, but somebody does shoot him, and then he dies right there on the farm. So this was like just a huge shock to the entire nation. There had never been a president assassinated before. The entire country's in shock. They don't know what to do. The war had just ended less than a week before this, so you can imagine all these things happening within like a 7-day period. But it's a very, very shocking end to the war, to end the war and then have President Lincoln assassinated at basically the same time. There's a really interesting history behind this picture. There were no pictures that survived of Abraham Lincoln in the casket. They were all destroyed. And then in like the 1960s or 1970s, there was a teenage boy in Illinois that found this in a museum, going through some papers for a project he was working on. And this is the only known photo that we have today of Lincoln being put in the casket. And he was actually buried in his home state of Illinois. So he was put on a train, and then that train went through the country, eventually ended up in Illinois, and then he was buried in Illinois. And if you want to read some really amazing history stuff, there have been multiple attempts to try and kidnap President Lincoln's body and then hold it for ransom. They weren't successful, but today the entire coffin that Lincoln is in is just basically encased in concrete, so nobody could ever try and steal it again. But people have tried to steal Abraham Lincoln's body and then basically hold it for ransom. So one of the impacts of the Civil War is that the size of government grows. So what that means is they created a bunch more government agencies, there's more government employees. This is the beginning of the government really beginning to have a lot of different entities as far as federal programs and things. Industry begins to really replace agriculture as the nation's major economic activity. So things really ramped up in factories during the war. That carries on after the war. And this is kind of a watershed moment, and the country begins to become more and more industrialized, partially because of what happens in the Civil War. The South is where most of the war was fought. It's badly damaged. They lost almost half their livestock, almost half of their farm machinery, railroad tracks, factories, bridges, all that stuff had been destroyed, and that's all going to have to be rebuilt. And then from just a financial sense, before the war, the South had about 30% of the nation's wealth. After the war, that goes down to about 12%. So this is going to be the really challenging part. How do we rebuild the nation after the war? Not only from a sense of physical stuff like factories and farms and stuff, but how do we bring back all these people that had fought a bloody war for the last 4 years against the United States government? How do we allow them to be able to vote again? How do we allow them to be citizens again? All of the slaves are freed in the South, so that's going to completely change all of the economics in the South. There's a lot of stuff that's going to happen after the war that in a lot of ways is as challenging, if not more challenging, than the war itself. That's called Reconstruction, and you guys will learn about that next year in your freshman U.S. history class. All right, so that's it. That's our last section of notes for Unit 8, and that is your last section of notes as 8th grade history students. All right, thanks, guys.